Welcome to Module 6 of the Mind Before Act, JSAFE and JP Group's Training of Trainers course on Radicalization, Prevention and Investigation. This module will focus on the prevention of Islamist radicalization in schools and online. Its contents have been produced by Berlin Free University, FUB. Unless specified otherwise, all of the following contents are property of Berlin Free University and cannot be used, reproduced, or disseminated without the university's permission. My name is Matthias Schreiber, and I work as a researcher for Islamist radicalization among young people and radicalization prevention in schools at Berlin Free University's Division of Developmental Science and Applied Developmental Psychology. During the next couple of hours, I will guide you through the self-study course on the prevention of Islamist radicalization in schools. Schools' role in preventing radicalization and violent extremism among young people cannot be underestimated. Every day, young people spend huge amounts of time in educational institutions. As a consequence, all professionals working in a school environment, that is, teachers, social workers, psychologists, administrative staff, or service contractors, carry considerable responsibilities and challenges in terms of prevention work, in addition to their actual functions. At the same time, people working in a school environment will also find great opportunities to prevent adolescents from being dragged into the destructive path of radicalization and violent extremism, as they spend that much time with young people day by day. So the purpose of this module is threefold. First, we want to sensitize educational professionals for the logics of processes of Islamist radicalization among young people. Second, we want to introduce them to observable behavioral indicators that might point to an ongoing radicalization process. And third, we'd like to present them with some preventative approaches that have proved to be effective in a school environment. In total, the module consists of 7 sections. We will start with a quick overview on some basic facts and figures about radical and extremist groups and individuals in the European Union and, as an example case, in Germany. We will then move on to briefly look into a radicalization terminology and some basic results from research into radicalization processes from a legal, social sciences and psychological perspective. The third chapter will be an in-depth section about the development of radicalization processes inspired and motivated by Islamist ideas and ideologies. After that, we will get to know in detail a variety of factors that fuel radicalization processes, as well as indicators through which ongoing radicalization processes can be detected. In the 5th section, we will talk about some basic characteristics of prevention theory and prevention work with a particular focus on educational institutions. This will also lay the groundwork for introducing you to the NetWave Radicalization Prevention Program, which has been developed by Berlin Free University and which we will look at in the subsequent section number 6. We will close the module with a quick introduction to the homework, which we would like you to do once you have worked through all the previous contents. In addition, we have also prepared 2 self-study tasks. The first one is a research on Islamist radical and extremist groups in your country, and the second one is an assessment of the prevention architecture in the educational institution you work in or in an educational institution you might know well. And we've also We've also included 4 videos in the module which we found quite helpful for the contents we're going to talk about. The first video has been produced by UNESCO and is about the educational sector's role in prevention work. The second video is a conference presentation by Christina Nemmer on extremist groups recruitment narratives. The third video is another conference presentation by Peter A. Neumann, in which he talks about extremist group strategies for using social media and the internet. And the fourth video is a teaching video produced by the Radicalisation Awareness Network on strategies for running a classroom discussion about radicalization-related content. Before getting into the details of prevention work at schools, it is highly important to familiarize yourself with some basic facts about Islamist radicalization in your country. On the following couple of slides, we're going to present some basic facts and figures about radical Islamists from the European Union and Germany. You're very welcome to have a look at those numbers to get an idea about the magnitude of this phenomenon on our continent. Just one important remark on this collection of data. Radical Islamists account for a very small percentage of Muslims who live in Europe and in Germany. And moreover, this small number of people splits into a very heterogeneous spectrum of radical groups. So we are dealing with a very particular and limited group of people. Now please think of the country where you work and try to answer some of the following questions. Which radical groups operate in your country and in which areas? How many followers do they have? What objectives do they pursue? What code systems do they utilize? And what recruitment methods and strategies do they draw upon? To find out more information, you could check, for instance, the Counter-Extremism Project's country profiles. Moreover, you could also have a look at reports produced by security authorities and civil society organizations working on radicalization and violent extremism in your country. And you could consult information from the European Union's Radicalisation Awareness Network and its experts, particularly those of the Education Working Group. In the next part of the module, we're going to have a more theoretical look at the phenomenon of radicalization and extremism. But before we dig down into the details of radicalization theory, it is highly important to gain clarity in the first step about the terminology we're going to use. So radicalization research in general distinguishes radicalization from extremism. Following that logic, radicalization is understood as a process in which an individual is increasingly questioning the legitimacy of certain normative regime and/or feels increasingly willing to fight the institutional structure of that regime. In that process, the individual would increasingly adopt political, social and/or religious ideas that challenge the dominant regime and process those views in radical practices and/or through a radical identity. Radicality would be a sort of endpoint of that process. Extremism, by contrast, is primarily a political concept and describes a specific condition rather than the process. It can be defined as the culmination of a process of radicalization, where the individual rejects all ideas, virtues, values, and convictions that define and guide a normative regime that is based on the principles of democracy, the rule of law, fundamental freedoms, and human rights. In both processes, the radicalized individual can, but not necessarily does, consider violence to be a viable means to achieve the destruction or change he or she wants to bring about. There are also lots of processes of peaceful radicalizations and extremisms. In fact, only a very small fraction of radicalized individuals at the end of their radicalization process actually resort to violence and perpetrate violent acts. Now, when we talk about Islamist radicalization, we mean a specific form of radicalization that is motivated, inspired, and substantiated by political and religious ideas brought from Islam and the Islamic world. All Islamist movements usually refer to different ideas, aspects, and events in Islamic sacred writings, doctrine, practice, tradition, jurisprudence, and history, and interpret them in a very closed, narrow, and restrictive way in accordance with their specific religious, social, and political worldviews and aspirations. This being said, one can clearly conclude Islamist movements are never only religious but always political. There's a great variety of different Islamist movements and organizations. The majority of them have their roots in Sunnism, but there are also some prominent Shiite groups such as Hezbollah. Most of the groups follow ideologies and pursue objectives which differ widely from each other and at times feature striking contradictions that are just irreconcilable. However, having said that, there's one aspect all Islamist movements and groups have in common. They usually aim to build a theocratic political and social order, where Allah's divine law, as interpreted specifically by each Islamist group, is predominant and only norm that structures, organizes, and governs virtually all spheres of life. Now, please watch the following UNESCO filmlet on the importance of educational institutions for the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism. Think about the following questions. Why do young people radicalize? And what can educational institutions do to prevent radicalization and violent extremism? From a legal perspective, it is important to highlight that radicalization and extremism are not criminal offenses per se. In Germany and in most other democratic countries, political, religious radical or extremist ideologies and activities, including proselytization, are in fact protected as a fundamental right by states' constitutions. In Germany, for instance, they are protected under Article 4 of the Constitution, which protects the freedom of religion and belief. Both phenomena are punishable only if they involve any kind of violence or activities that aim to overthrow the existing political, constitutional and social order. For instance, offenses Islamists are usually prosecuted for in Germany comprise threatening commission of serious criminal offense, disturbance of public peace by threatening to commit offenses, preparation of a serious violent offense endangering the state, establishment of relations for purpose of committing a serious violent offense endangering the state, financing of terrorism, forming a terrorist organization, or supporting foreign criminal and terrorist organizations. From a social sciences perspective, it is important to highlight the following insights research has found out about radicalization. Adolescents can be particularly susceptible to radical or extremist ideologies and mindsets for a variety of reasons. For instance, radical groups usually offer clarity, guidance, and unambiguity in a world full of complexities, ambiguities, and disorientation, as they usually tend to divide the world into black and white. A sense of maintaining control might arise once adolescents accept such binary worldviews. In a stage of life where adolescents very often seek to detach from their parents' generations and look for social reorientation, very often through provocation, radical groups appear to be a decent vehicle of rebellion. Joining such a group might provide them with a sense of clear-cut detachment. Also, radical groups offer a sense of belonging and community, where adolescents may gain recognition and receive different forms of support at difficult times in life. They might feel a sense of being part of an elite once they join the group. Moreover, radical groups may offer a seemingly easy way to cope with or solve complicated identity issues or identity crises, as one's ethnic, cultural, social and religious roots lose importance once one has joined them. Apart from that, there are also other social-political push factors, such as marginalization, inequality, discrimination, persecution, and the lack of education, that have proven to fuel radicalization processes. In addition, active recruitment of followers by radical groups has proven to be a decisive pull factor why adolescents join them. Having said that, merely religious aspects in many cases appear to be a rather minor factor why young people decide to join a radical group. From a psychological perspective, research into the social, legal and clinical biographies of Islamist terrorist attackers, among many others, have brought to light three major insights. First, Islamist violent attacks can be summed up as acts of expressive demonstrative violence, or as a kind of violence that, in addition to the physical and psychological harm it causes, also possesses a strong communicative layer. In other words, the attackers and their masterminds do not only aim to cause as much damage to as much people as possible through their violence, but also consciously seek to stage them acting out violence in order to convey a certain message to a specific audience that has to witness their attacks directly or through the press and social media, and that is also expected to acknowledge their deeds. Second, virtually all attacks did not constitute spontaneous or factor in crimes. They were crimes that have rather been long planned and explicitly targeted specific groups of victims, and they were crimes that usually marked the endpoint of a previous process of radicalization which over time intensified and accelerated and moved the individual each time closer to committing an act of violence. And third, these processes of previous radicalization were usually linked to an ongoing psychosocial crisis unfolding over time in the individual's personal life, and they were accompanied by corresponding warning signs and behaviors in terms of their radicalization or their psychosocial crisis that outsiders were able to observe. So what do we learn from these research results about radicalization? First, extremist violence does not emerge all of a sudden out of the blue. It is always preceded by a process of radicalization, and this process can be fast or slow, can be a matter of years, months, or even days, but there has always been a process of increasingly adopting radical ideas in the first place before individuals resort to violence. And this process usually covers several stages or phases of increasing radicalization. This is even true for cases of so-called lone wolf Islamist attackers. They seemingly express radicalized online and their radicalization occurred completely unperceived, but they also went through a process of prior radicalization. Second, as virtually all processes of radicalization are preceded by a link to a personal crisis in people's biographies, particularly those of young people, radicalization can be interpreted as a catalyst or an expression or consequence of a psychosocial or developmental crisis individuals go through or try to cope with. And third, as observable signs and behaviors in many cases indicate a radicalization process or psychosocial crisis is ongoing, there is very often a great window of opportunity to stop such processes before they escalate into violence. In order to better understand how radicalization evolves over time, in the next part of the module we're going to have a look at the developmental model scientists have distilled from research specifically for radicalization processes. This model, which divides an ideal type-like radicalization process into 5 stages, has been developed mainly on the basis of biographies of young school shooters and Islamist terrorist attackers, which have been analyzed from a social sciences and a psychological perspective. Although these groups of violent perpetrators represent only a very small portion of radicalized individuals, the model's initial stages are also quite helpful to understand how radicalization processes in general Following this model, the individual trapped in a process of radicalization would move from an initial crisis or so-called grievances that can be occasioned by a critical event in the individual's life and are additionally fueled by individual vulnerabilities and persistent strain factors in the individual's broader social environment into a process of transforming his or her self-conception from being a victim to being a sort of martyr. Once the individual has arrived at that stage of the radicalization process, it could then move on to develop plans to wage revenge against those who supposedly have caused injustices or grievances to him or to her, or at least against those who supported them, and usually triggered by another traumatic event, would then arrive at some kind of violent endpoint, which at its final stages would first lead to the immediate preparation of his or her plan to carry out an act of violence, and ultimately escalate into him or her violently acting out what he or she has been plotting previously. In the following section, we are now going to have a look at the details of this model. As I already said, radicalization processes usually prosper when individuals are confronted with conflicts, crisis, or any kind of acts of discrimination they consider unjust. In other words, all radicalization processes start with an individual or a collective grievance. These situations might occur either in people's own life, or in their close personal environment, or in other parts of the world, or in all places at once. Grievances can be perceived as an individual or personal issue, or as a rather collective matter, and an individual might experience them him or herself, or witness them directly or through the media or the internet. The individual becomes aware there is a mismatch between how he or she wishes reality to be and how reality actually is. In many cases, feelings of emptiness are closely linked to that process, as are attributions of victimhood. Individuals might feel they are victims of unjust or discriminatory actions themselves, or feel others are victims of such actions, or both things at once. Circumstantial factors, such as individual social vulnerabilities, usually nourish such processes. For instance, a lack of role models in the individual's family, unemployment, identity diffusion, social marginalization and exclusion, inequality, a lack of acceptance and recognition by peers, any kind of psychosocial crisis, or psychological dispositions. In cases of Islamist radicalization, social or racial discrimination often is a fundamental issue, particularly when people's biographies are characterized by histories of migration and fragmented social-cultural identities. For instance, in many cases in Germany, radicalized adolescents who were born into migrant families felt trapped between social-cultural norms, patterns and expectations of their parents' or grandparents' country of origin and those in Germany, their actual home country. In neither country they felt completely accepted as a full member of society. As a consequence, religions such as Islam acquired utmost importance for the definition of their identities. In the second phase of a radicalization process, the grieving individual would encounter radical ideologies, for instance those offered by the different manifestations of Islamism with which he or she would increasingly identify. Those ideologies offer a sense of belonging to a group of peers, solidarity in sharp contrast to other non-believers or infidels, and strategies to fight perceived injustices, for instance the purification of the vicious and wicked ordinary society with or without the use of force. The conflicts, crises or discriminations witnessed or even experienced by individuals had already increased their proneness, not to say their vulnerability, to accept the interpretations and solutions offered by those radical groups to cope with such situations. Identification with radical ideologies operates at both the social and the cognitive level. Individuals, step by step, adopt the patterns of perception that are typical of radical ideologies and increasingly narrow their social relationships down to those persons who share their interpretations of the world. Proactive recruitment by Islamist groups plays a vital role, particularly at that point in the process of radicalization. Local religious associations, sports clubs, and social media and the internet count among the most important recruitment methods. Those adolescents who know relatively little about Islam and go through a stage of life full of uncertainties are more susceptible to radical ideologies. Trusted persons such as peers or older confidants usually act as key persons for recruitment. Once immersed into the universe of a radical ideology or a radical group, the individual, in the next phase of his or her radicalization process, would then experience a conscious or sometimes also subconscious change in his or her self-perception. Internally, individuals very often really find themselves as the vengers of injustices and discrimination, or as martyrs serving a higher deity such as Allah. At the same time, past experiences and feelings of one's own weakness, impotence, helplessness, insignificance and solitude, as well as former self-conceptualizations as a victim of injustices and discrimination will all faint or even be eliminated from the individual self-perception. Very often, those transformations will also be externalized through observable changes in the individual's behaviors or different appearance in the public, for instance in terms of clothing. In any case, this redefinition of the self from a psychological perspective can clearly be interpreted as a turning point in the radicalization process. During the last two stages of the radicalization process, individuals would then move on to plot, prepare, and put into practice concrete actions to bring about the changes their radical worldviews need to come true. And at the same time, they would elaborate the reasonings that would justify their deeds. If they lack competences to advance their plans, they would make great efforts at this point in time to acquire the skills needed to put them into practice. Very often, planning and preparation would be clandestine and carried out in complete isolation on a small group of people, which means that the individual would also further narrow down his or her circle of social relationships. If the radicalized individual's plans and actions would involve any kind of violence, they would make great efforts at this stage of the radicalization process to learn how to exert violence in case they lack the knowledge, procure the weapons they need, and train how to use them. Further escalation of planning and the final impetus to put plans into practice is preceded very often, but not always, by another trigger event. For instance, individuals experience themselves once again as a victim, or they witness once again alleged or genuine injustices and discriminations. In a very small number of radicalization cases, this process can end with the individual perpetrating an act of violence. However, it is important to say that only very few processes of radicalization actually turn violent. The vast majority of individuals trapped in processes of radicalization do not even arrive at this stage of the process and do not cross the border from supporting the use of violence theoretically to actually exerting violence in practice. In fact, it wouldn't even be presumptuous to say a considerable number of radical individuals would even theoretically reject violence as a legitimate means to achieve their radical Now please watch the following conference presentation by Christina Nanwell to learn more about what factors attract young people to join extremist groups and which narratives extremist groups use for recruitment. Think about the following questions. Have you already been confronted with some of the situations portrayed in the presentation in your work environment? And keeping these situations in mind, what should you change in your workplace or your working routines? And what should you maintain?